Hello everyone, my name is Andy Hopper. I'm a Principal Solutions Architect here at AWS. This session is XNT 301, porting .NET Framework applications to .NET Core on Linux. So what will we be talking about in this session? First, we're going to be covering why customers are interested in porting their applications from .NET Framework over to .NET. Next, we'll describe what the porting assistant is and how AWS is making it available to customers. We'll also cover how your users can use the porting assistant to convert their code from .NET Framework over to .NET Core and .NET 5. And then we'll actually spend the majority of the time in this session actually going through a demo where I take an existing ASP.NET MVC application that's leveraging Entity Framework 6, and I'll convert it over to .NET 5 and using Entity Framework Core 5.0. And then finally, we'll have a wrap up with some final thoughts. So, why are customers interested in porting their applications? So first and foremost, they may be interested in running their applications on containers. And let's face it, the Linux container ecosystem has just been out there longer and it's more mature than the Windows container ecosystem. The next is they may want to leverage cloud-native applications. They want to build serverless architectures using services such as AWS Lambda. Currently, Lambda only supports the .NET Core runtime, so they're unable to run their .NET Framework applications on that. Next is some customers are finding that they simply achieve better performance when they're running applications on the Linux operating system instead of their Windows boxes. Then we get the more practical ones. When you're running on Linux, you don't have to worry about Windows licenses, so you're able to save quite a bit of money while you're operating your workloads. Now, another very important thing that I want to point out is with the release of .NET 5 earlier in November, Microsoft has indicated that the .NET framework is now in legacy maintenance mode. So there's going to be no new feature development. There will only be bug fixes and security patches applied to it. And all new feature development is going to be performed on the .NET runtime, so .NET 5 and up. Then last, I just wanted to point out, one of the really nice things about .NET Core and .NET 5 and up is that you can target processor architectures other than Intel x86-64. You can even have your applications run on the ARM64 CPU architecture, and we'll be talking about that a little bit later. So, Andy, I hear you say, porting is really hard. Well, yes, it can be. You may have incompatible NuGet packages that are only compatible with .NET Framework or on Windows. Or you may find that there are API changes from .NET Framework into the .NET Core and .NET 5 and up ecosystem. And then if you're following Microsoft's own porting guide for converting to .NET Core, there are a lot of manual steps you have to go through. You have to create new projects that are targeting the new runtimes. You have to reestablish all of your cross-project dependencies and reacquire your NuGet packages. And then lastly, you've got to copy all of your code into those projects. Well, this is where the porting assistant comes in. What it will do is it'll scan, it'll analyze your existing solutions and projects, it'll perform a compatibility assessment to make sure that it's going to be able to be ported over into .NET Core. It'll also find out what the cross-project interdependencies are to help you understand where you should focus your efforts first. It'll also tell you if you're using any NuGet packages that are incompatible with the .NET Core or .NET 5 runtimes. And then lastly, it'll also tell you whether or not you're leveraging any API calls in the .NET Framework runtime that don't exist in .NET Core. And then once it's all done, you can actually export the results of the assessment just in case you want to take a snapshot of your progress or you want to build tools that automate, based on that information. So how does someone use the porting assistant? Well, first, of course, you have to download the tool. And in order to use it, you need to have, whatever target framework you're going to be pointing your applications at. So currently, the tool supports .NET Core 2.1 and 3.1. Again, .NET 5 just got released, so we're in the process of adding support for that right now as we speak. And of course, you need .NET Framework because after all, that's what your applications run on top of. And then you, of course, need the source code for the source application that you're going to be porting over into the .NET Core or .NET 5 ecosystem. So what is the workflow for a user? Again, you have to install the tool, make sure you've got all the prerequisites installed on your box. Then you'll run the tool against the solution and you'll actually perform the porting activity. And once you've done that, you now have a new solution with all of your code. Now, what you'll then need to do is, resolve any incompatibilities that surface during this porting process. The porting assistant will not magically rewrite your code for you. So if you have old incompatible API calls, you'll need to repoint that so they're actually leveraging .NET Core compatible APIs. Luckily, what the tool will do, and I'll show you this in the demo, is it actually point out to you where in your code base you're actually using those incompatible API calls. And then once you've actually performed your porting activities and you've got your code building again, you're then able to deploy it. You can put it onto Linux, you can put it into containers, and in fact, I've actually got an example right here in the slide deck that shows you a walkthrough for how you can take your newly ported .NET Core application and deploy it on Elastic Beanstalk with a Linux operating system. All right, so this brings us to my favorite time of day, which is demo time. And what we're going to do here is we're going to take an ASP.NET MVC application running on .NET Framework on Windows, leveraging Entity Framework 6.0. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to go through the entire process to port this into a .NET 5 application using Entity Framework 5.0 that's capable of running on a Linux box.
All right, so here we are in Visual Studio, and what we have here is our ASP.NET solution. Now, if I take a look at the project properties, you'll see that I'm targeting .NET Framework 4.7.1. And the other thing you may notice is that this is reflecting a common pattern we see in applications. What I've done is I've got my web project, and then I have a separate assembly or project that's going to define all of our data objects that we're using inside the application. And then we've got another project that defines our DB context. So let's go ahead and run this application on my local development machine. We'll give ASP.NET a second to crank up. So there we go. This is just a standard ASP.NET application. I've based it off the project templates and I made a few UI changes, but I've also tweaked it to add a scaffolded controller for a catalog of items. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and click that to see our list of items. And under the covers, we're actually using that Entity Framework DB context to connect to a SQL local DB instance. And what I've done actually is I've got my app data folder here, and I've actually got the MDF file for my local DB. Okay, great. So we've got a functional application running under .NET Framework. Let's go ahead and get to porting this up project to .NET Core. Now, in this case, I've already installed the porting assistant and taken care of the prerequisites, so I'll just go ahead and start it. As you can see, we include some information about the tool here, along with the link to the documentation to help you get started. And I'll click on the Get Started button. Now, the first time you start the assistant, it'll prompt you to choose an AWS profile. If you don't already have one defined, you can simply add one. But in my case, on my local development machine, I've already defined a profile named default, so I'll select that one. And now it's time to pick a solution. So we'll go ahead and navigate to our projects folder, and we'll go to the Porting Assistant, and we'll add the Porting Assistant demo, and then we'll click on Assess. Now, the assessment can take anywhere from seconds to minutes, depending upon the complexity of your solution. So we'll wait for it to complete its assessment. All right, so our assessment has been completed. So let's go ahead and view the details. Now, what you'll see is an overview of the assessment it performed. And one of the things it'll do is show a portability score, which is currently in this version the ratio between the compatible and incompatible packages. Now, full disclosure, we discovered a bug while recording this demo that caused it to show a portability score of 0%. I assure you we're going to be able to port this, but we're going to fix that bug in the next version. All right. Now, below, what you're going to see is a list of the projects it identified in that solution. And as you can see, we've got a web project, those data model objects, as well as the that DB context project. And if we click on the Project References tab, we'll see a nice visualization of project interdependencies. Now, this particular graph is pretty simple. I don't have that many projects, but in a more complex application, you can use this view to help you identify which projects are going to have the most impact as you start your porting process. Next, it'll show you the list of NuGet packages it found in your solution, along with whether or not it's going to be compatible with .NET Core. It also has a tab that shows all of the incompatible API calls that you're going to have inside your source code. And I should point out, the porting assistant will not modify your code for you. So you do need to go into your code and fix up these sorts of references. And we're going to see that in the demo in just a moment. And then the last thing I wanted to point out is it'll also tell you what source files contain incompatible API calls, as well as how many API calls it has, which can help you prioritize and distribute the work that you're going to be doing during your porting effort. The last thing I just wanted to show out in this pane is that you also have the ability to export the details that were generated by this assessment. So if you wanted to do any kind of automation or take a snapshot of the state of your project, you can use the export assessment report to generate a zip file. And then inside that zip file, there'll be comma separated value or CSV files that contain the details from the various tabs. So let's go ahead and port our application. So we're going to go back to the projects tab. I'll click the checkbox to select all projects, and then I'll click on the port project button. Next, it's going to ask me where I'd like to put the new project. And you've got two options. I can either copy it to a new location, and that's certainly the most conservative way to do it. It'll copy all of your source files, create new CS projects in a new location, leaving your source code untouched. Or if you've got good source code control, you can simply modify the source in place. And if you have any problems, or if you just want to revert back to the previous version, you just let your source code control handle that reversion. In my case, I'm going to go ahead and tell it to copy it to a new location. And to do that, I've got to give it a where that new location is. So I will create a brand new folder in my projects folder, and I will call it ported. And then I'll select that folder. All right, so now the tool is showing what it's going to do. It indicates all the projects it's going to port as well as what target framework they're coming from. And then I've got the option to choose the target framework that I'm going to port the application to. Now, .NET 5 just got released, so we don't yet natively support it inside the tool. We'll actually make some manual changes to target .NET 5 when I get into that part. But for now, what I'll do is I'll choose .NET Core App 3.1. And then next, I have the option to choose NuGet package upgrades. Now, I've got a whole bunch of UI libraries that I've referenced through NuGet, and that changed pretty significantly in ASP.NET Core. So I'm just going to go ahead and fix that in the CS proj after we've done the porting process. So let's go ahead and click on the port button. Now, the porting, again, similar to the assessment, depending on the complexity of your solution, it can take on the order from seconds to minutes, depending on how many projects you've got and how much code there is in each project. Okay, great. So the porting has now been completed. Let's open our newly ported project inside Visual Studio. So we'll open the project, we'll navigate to ported, and we'll tell it to choose Porting Assistant Demo. So what we have now are our .NET Core projects. And so if we look, we'll see it's currently targeting .NET Core 3.1. And let's go ahead and change that to .NET 5. So we'll do that inside the ASP.NET project, and we'll also do that inside our data access project. And while we're here, let's actually go ahead and start from the bottom up, handling any of the manual changes we need to do. So first and foremost, we'll want to make some changes to the NuGet packages we're using. So in this case, you see I'm still referencing Entity Framework 6, which is the .NET Framework version of Entity Framework. And I'll give a quick shout out to my friend Jeremy Lickness and the Entity Framework team at Microsoft. The new Entity Framework Core 5.0 that got released along with .NET 5 is great, and I want to use it. So let's actually remove that Entity Framework 6 reference. And what I'll do instead is I'll add a NuGet package reference to Entity Framework, Core, SQL Server. There we go. And I'll install that inside my data access. I'll accept the license agreements. And then next, what we need to do is a little bit of source code changes. So first, you'll notice that I'm referencing system data entity. This is not supported in .NET Core. Instead, it's going to be using a different package, which is called Microsoft.Entity Framework Core. So let's go ahead and we'll change this for all CS files that I have in my solution. I've got a couple of places where I'm using that system data entity namespace. Great. And then finally, you'll notice that it's unhappy about the constructor. Well, that's because in Entity Framework Core, they've changed it from that one that takes the name of a connection string to something that takes a DB context options object. And that'll be of ASP.NET example context. And I'll name that argument options. And then what I'll do is rather than passing the name of that connection string to my base class, I'll simply pass the options object on down. So let's go ahead and compile this project and just verify that everything is successful. Great. So let's move on to my web application. All right, so we've already changed it over to .NET 5.0, and inside the CS Proj, as you may have gathered by now, we're actively maintaining the porting assistant, and one of the areas that we're enhancing is how it handles ASP.NET projects. Incidentally, we've open sourced the code for this tool, so if you have ideas for future enhancements, please do get engaged. We'd love to hear from you, and we welcome pull requests. So currently, the tool does not automatically indicate that it's an ASP.NET project. So what I'll do to fix that is I'll add the .web suffix to the SDK reference. Next, you'll also notice there are a couple of things that are being added by Visual Studio and ASP.NET that I'm not going to need in the ASP.NET Core world, including these imports. Also, you'll also notice that there are a bunch of content references. In ASP.NET Core, that concept of content files is replaced by a new folder called www.root. So I'm going to go ahead and remove all of that, but I will keep my project references. And let's go ahead and save this. Now, Visual Studio is going to detect that I've actually made a change to the type of project. So I'm going to go ahead and let it reload the project. Great. So next, let's go ahead and tweak up our NuGet package references. In the world of ASP.NET Core, I no longer have to make a whole bunch of references that I used to have to with the standard project template. However, there are a few things that actually changed with the way ASP.NET handles certain things. Case in point, global ASAX is no longer supported under ASP.NET Core. That actually requires a startup.cs to tell it how to initialize your application. So let's go ahead and delete that file. In addition, there's also these files in app.start. That's actually going to get replaced with a new NuGet package called build bundler minifier, as well as some of the things that are handled with the routes and filters are going to be handled through attribution inside ASP.NET Core. So I'm just actually going to nuke the app start folder. In the next release of the toolkit, what it actually will do is just mark those as backup and not compile the code in there, just so you can see what used to be in there. Now that I've done that, what I do need to do is add a NuGet package reference. So I'm going to add the build bundler minifier, which is the new tool to replace that bundle config CS file. In addition, to replace the functionality of that global ASAX, as well as those NuGet package references for the client-side libraries, I'm going to go ahead and add a few files manually. Now, I do want to point out that while I'm currently manually adding a bunch of these files, in the next release of the tool, we'll be adding a few of these things automatically for you. Case in point, app settings will be migrated from your web.config. Things like, libman will be added automatically, as well as program and startups.cs. And these are simply just the boilerplate code templates that you would get from creating a brand new ASP.NET project. So I can add these. And incidentally, because I created this from a project template, it had a Docker file that targets Windows. I'm actually going to replace it with the Docker file that supports Linux containers. So I'll go ahead and say yes to that. Great. Now that I've added these files, I'm going to go ahead and tell it to restore my client-side libraries. And you'll notice what it did was that it added a new folder called www.root. Again, this replaces that concept of a content, build action in your old MS build style CS proj. Now, the www.root folder is going to be where things like my CSS, my fonts, my images, those sorts of things should live. So I'm going to go ahead and move these folders from the root down into that www.root folder. And yes, I wanted to go ahead and copy everything over. All right, awesome. So let's see here. Now, we'll notice that I made some changes to how we interact with our DB context. So let's go ahead and go into our startup file. And one of the things I want to do is actually change how I'm initializing that DB context. In the original code, it actually took the name of the connection string. What I'll be doing here instead is I'll actually let our dependency injection framework take care of adding a DB context to my application. And I will tell it that it's going to be in my data.aspnet example context. And then what this does is it'll take an action. And so I'll give it an options object. And then with that, what I'll do is opt.use SQL Server. And then it needs the name of the connection string. So this is where that new location is going to be. And so what I'll do is I'll actually use the configuration object and I'll do get connection string. And in the connection strings list, it's actually using the name of the ASP.NET example context. So what I'll do is I'll do name of, and then I'll do data.aspnet example context, and we'll save that. All right, great. Now, the next thing we need to do is also change how our controllers are going to interact with that DB context. So one thing you may notice is from the original scaffolded code, it actually is using a default constructor that gave it, so it used that default constructor to indicate what connection string name is going to be. And what we're going to do instead is we'll actually have it to where our catalog item controller will just simply take an instance of that DB context as a dependency injected object. So what we'll do is we'll take an ASP.NET example context and we'll call it DB. And what we'll do is we'll actually set this .db equal to that dependency injected to ASP.NET example context. The other thing we need to do is you'll notice that we're referencing system web MVC. Well, that namespace is no longer present in ASP.NET Core. So let's do a global search and replace. In any place where I see system web MVC, I'm going to replace that with Microsoft.asp.NET Core MVC. So let's replace all. And that got replaced in a couple of locations. And then finally, there are just a couple of code changes we need to make. So again, these are either objects or methods on the controller that don't exist in ASP.NET or actually got changed. So what we'll do is we'll actually change all references for the HTTP status code result. And what we'll do instead is we'll replace that with status code, and we'll just cast the that enumeration to an integer. And we'll replace all of those. And the other thing you may notice, now that's working, is I've also got a squiggly under HTTP not found. Well, that's because all references to HTTP not found are simply replaced with not found. So we'll go ahead and do a search and replace on that as well. All right, so now we're in the home stretch. The last little thing we need to pay attention to is Razor files in ASP.NET Core are, dropped a few things that were supported in the .NET Framework version. So first, let's go ahead and take a look at our layout.cshtml. And you'll notice it's going to be unhappy with styles and scripts. Well, that's because in ASP.NET Core, they just came to the realization that all these tags were doing was simply just emitting boilerplate HTML. So what we'll do instead of styles.render is we'll replace that with a link, which is going to be of type style sheet. Excuse me, rel style sheet. There we go. And then its href is going to be inside my CSS, and it will be my site.min.css. And then we'll close off our tag. Next, we've got that scripts render to the modernizer library. Well, that came from a reference I put in that bundle, the libman.json. So we'll replace this with the script. We'll tell it the source is going to be under lib, and we've got modernizer, and then we'll take the minified modernizer, and then we'll close off that tag. And if we go further down, we've also got a couple of other script renders. In this case, it's for jQuery and for Bootstrap. So let's go ahead and replace these two as well. So we'll replace this with the script tag, and the source will be under lib, and we'll do jQuery, and we'll take the minified version of jQuery. And then lastly, we'll do the same thing for my Bootstrap. So we'll do a scripts tag here, and the source will be under Twitter Bootstrap. And we'll do the JS, and we'll just do the minified version of bootstrap.js. Okay, great. So we're almost done. The last little thing we need to do is change a couple of files inside the catalog items. So you'll notice inside the create and edit, we've got that @scripts tag in here, and it's using the unobtrusive jQuery validation. So let's actually change that and fix it to use the jQuery validation tag. So we'll do script, and we'll tell it source, and that's going to come from lib, jQuery validation, and we'll use the minified version of that library. And just to make life a little bit easier, we'll go ahead and copy that, and we're going to put that in edit as well. Incidentally, I know where to go in my project to make these changes because earlier, before I did this demo, I simply ran my project and I found all the build errors. Honestly, that may be the easiest way for you to identify, other than looking at the list of API and source file references in the assessment report. You let just Visual Studio build the list of items that you need to do. Okay, great. So we've made all of our changes. Let's go ahead and see if everything builds successfully. Awesome. So it builds. I guess that means I can ship it. So let's go ahead and run this thing locally just to verify the application comes up and running. Great, there's my application. And if I click on catalog, there's my list of items. Awesome. So we've got that up and running. So now, now I need to prove to everybody that we've actually ported our application so that it can run on Linux. So to do that, first what I'll do is I'll cd over into my ported folder and I'll run .NET publish. I'll actually generate a package that I can move to another machine and I'll tell it to use a release configuration. All right. So what I'll do now is copy the output of that publish into a zip file. So let's go ahead and I'll just use the PowerShell tool for compressing, and I will have it come from ASP.NET example, bin, release. Oh, goodness. Oh, .NET 5.0, doy. There we go, publish. And then I want to just take everything under publish. And what I'll do is I'll create a local file called ported.zip. Okay, now that I've got that, now it's time to upload this to S3. So I'll call write S3 object, and I'll tell it that I want to copy the file ported.zip. I'll give it a bucket name. In this case, it's going to be a bucket that I own. I'll call it US East 1, Andy Hop at, whoops, got to spell Andy Hop right, at amazon.com, no comma and com. And then I'll give it a key name, and I'll give it a name like demos ported.zip, for example. All right, so I'll let that upload to S3. Okay, great. So now let's move over to a Linux box so we can actually see this up and running. So I've got a EC2 machine here. I've got it configured to run under Amazon Linux 2. And let's go ahead and connect to it using Session Manager. All right, so for those of you who aren't familiar with it, Session Manager is simply a way for you to be able to connect to EC2 instances without having to go directly through SSH. It just gives you a nice console, which gives you basically the same experience you get through an SSH session. So let's cd into our home folder, and incidentally, when you're using Session Manager, it'll be under a folder called SSM User. So let's get that ported zip file that I created. So we'll do AWS S3 CP. It'll come from that bucket I named, US East 1, Andy Hop at Amazon.com. And it'll come from the demos subfolder and ported.zip. And then I'll copy it to my local folder here. Okay, great. So now that I got my zip file, let's actually copy this into a location where my application will run from. So to do that, I will call sudo and I'll make a new directory under the opt folder and I'll call it ported. Next, let's unzip the contents of my zip file. So what I'll do is sudo unzip and I'll start from my ported.zip folder and I'll tell it the location that I'd like everything to go to. Awesome. Okay, so we have our application that's been ported over to that. So the next thing to do is for us to cd into that opt ported folder, and we're actually going to run it, just like I would if I created, like, say, a system daemon to run it under the Kestrel hosting process. So I'll do .NET ASP.NET example DLL. And now, oops, hang on, you'll notice that it's still listening on port 5000. I made a small goof. I need to actually tell it, hey, I want you to listen on the HTTP port of 80. So I'll just tell it to listen on all interfaces on 80. Boom. Oh, yes. And when we're doing that, we need to make sure we do that under sudo. Okay, awesome. Now we're listening under port 80. Now to do that, to actually see my application, let's actually take a look here. If we go back, we'll see it's got a public IP address of 18 to 12, et cetera, et cetera. So let's go ahead and copy that. And let's go to that let's go to that location using our web browser here. So let's try and copy that again. There we go. Let's paste that here. And hey, we've got our ASP.NET application. It's being served from my Linux box on that IP address on port 80. Oh, and actually, there's one thing I forgot to mention to you guys. So we've got our application, it's running on Linux, but what I didn't point out to you guys is that This is an ARM64 machine. So we're actually not only running under Linux, but we're running on Linux on a different processor architecture. Instead of running on an x86 machine, we're actually using a Graviton 2 box, which is using the ARM64 instruction set. So there you have it, folks. We've got our admittedly simple ASP.NET application that's using Entity Framework. And what we did was we ported it from .NET Framework over to .NET 5 on Linux. And not only do we have it running on Linux, but we have it running on ARM64, which can be a very cost-effective way for you to run your applications. Customers are finding that they're actually saving up to 40% by migrating workloads from x86 over into ARM64.
All right. So we hope you guys have seen a lot of interesting things using the porting assistant. And as you start using it, we're sure that you're going to have questions. And in order to get any support that you need using the porting assistant, I've got an email address right here in this deck. If you go to AWS Porting Assistant Support at Amazon.com, we've got the entire porting assistant team who pay attention to any incoming emails on that, and we're happy to help you resolve any issues that you may have. So let's talk about what we saw today. So first, the porting assistant allows you to take your existing .NET Framework applications and port them over into .NET Core and .NET 5. And what this does is open up the entire AWS ecosystem to you. Not only are you able to leverage things like Linux containers, run your applications on Linux underneath services such as Fargate, for example, which currently only supports the Linux operating system, or using serverless architectures like Lambda, but it also helps you remove a lot of the manual heavy lifting that we'd normally have to do to convert a .NET Framework application over into .NET Core. The porting assistant is free for download from AWS. I've got the link right there in the deck. And on top of all that, it largely helps you eliminate a lot of the steps that you'd have to normally go through on your own. And let's face it, us human beings, we kind of suck at following lists of instructions. The porting assistant automates a lot of the steps that you'd have to go through and largely eliminates the chance of you making an error while you're doing that. And then finally, you can always use the assessment results that are generated by the tool. So again, you can take snapshots of your progress. And if you have like your own ticketing system where you want to generate work items to help your development team accelerate the process of migrating your code, you can use the output of the assessment report to help automate those things. So the next steps are, please, if you have a chance, rate the session. It helps us improve the quality of our content and makes things better for you and for other customers. Also, please download the porting assistant. I've got a URL right here. It is free for download. Again, all you need is to have the .NET Framework, and you need to have a version of the .NET Core runtime installed on your machine. In addition, I also have several related sessions to this particular topic regarding things like running your applications more effectively on Windows, how to do things like managing other Microsoft workloads in AWS, and also how to do things like take your existing .NET Framework applications and modernize your application development with CI/CD processes that deploy to Elastic Beanstalk. All right, everyone. Thank you very much for joining me during this session, and enjoy the rest of your reInvent.